Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Misguided, the podcast. I'm Matthew Facciani, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Joel Breakstone. Since 2013, Dr. Breakstone has led the Stanford History Education Group, which later evolved into the Digital Inquiry Group, where he now serves as co-founder and executive director. With a PhD in education from Stanford, Dr. Breakstone has conducted groundbreaking research on media and digital literacy. We discuss how to better equip students with the skills to navigate today's complex information landscape. Dr. Breakstone shares his journey from teaching high school history to leading research in media literacy, digital inquiry, and civic online reasoning. We explore the challenges students face in evaluating online sources, the evidence-based strategies that work, and how digital literacy education is evolving in the age of AI-driven misinformation. If you're interested in how we can teach people to think critically rather than just telling them what to think, this episode is for you. I'm really curious about if you could share your journey from being a history teacher to then getting a PhD in history education and then co-founding and leading this digital inquiry group. Can you share about what that journey was like and what led you to that direction?
Yeah, so I was a history major in college, and then I got a job teaching high school history in a rural high school in Vermont. And when I began teaching, the main item that was left before by my predecessor was the classroom set of The American Pageant by Bailey, Kennedy, and Cohen, a classroom set of textbooks and little else. And so I was left to try to figure out how to support my students to understand that history was more than the single narrative of a textbook. And I wanted my students to understand that as historians, we navigated competing accounts and tried to see how evidence allowed us to answer questions about the past. And so I wanted my students to read historical documents. But when I gave my students historical documents, they were really hard for 15-year-olds to read, and they certainly were not excited to read lengthy primary documents at 7:35 in the morning. And so, I figured out some things over the course of my teaching career of excerpts are a really good idea rather than, 15-page sources, and word banks help students with challenging vocabulary. But I had a lot of questions about how to do that better, and more importantly, how educators could be supported in having their students reckon with the past and to have an opportunity to engage with real historical evidence. And I discovered an organization in California that was dealing with these issues called the Stanford History Education Group at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. And I applied for that program, and I was lucky to get in, and I packed up my life into a moving truck and drove across the country and did grad school at Stanford. And while I was there, we at the Stanford History Education Group began to distribute free online resources. First, the Reading Like a Historian curriculum, and then Beyond the Bubble assessment short tasks that help students to engage in the ways of reading that historians do. And there was a lot of interest in those resources. And so at the end of my time as a grad student, I began to work full-time at the Stanford History Education Group to distribute those materials to teachers all across the country and do professional development. But we also quickly became aware of the fact that so often students are becoming informed and educated online, and that students were not receiving the best tools to make sense of all the information that is streaming across their devices. And so about a decade ago, we were approached by the McCormick Foundation that was focused on supporting various programs around digital literacy as well as civic engagement. And they asked if we could make some short assessments in the style of those history assessments that we had previously made that would give us a better sense of how students are engaging with online sources and whether or not these programs that they were supporting were effective at preparing students for digital citizenship in our present digital age. And so we made these short tasks and began to give them to students all across the country. And we quickly discovered that students really struggled across the board with even the most basic kinds of evaluations. Could students identify whether or not an advertisement labeled sponsored content was an ad or a news story? Students had trouble with that. Giving students social media posts that claimed to show voting irregularities in the United States, but actually came from Russia. Students could not do that. And so we actually published the results of that work in November of 2016 in the wake of the first election of Donald Trump. And there's an enormous amount of interest in the work. And one of the big questions that came to us was, well, how do we help students do better? And we didn't yet have curriculum materials to do that. And so that was when we really turned to trying to design resources that would equip students to be better consumers of online information, not just identifying some of those shortcomings.
That's really great that you're able to reach such a broad audience. I was just seeing a paper the other day, or a report that showed that some of the resources that your group has been doing is one of the most popular free civics education online resources that's available. So it's reaching so many people. And that's great because, not everyone has an opportunity to go to college, or even if they do go to college, they might not get access to this type of information that you're teaching. So I also want to ask, big picture, how do you categorize media literacy and digital literacy? Like, how do you define those terms? And then what are some evidence-based strategies for improving those abilities?
Yeah, so, the realm of media literacy is really broad, right? It's everything from staying safe online to creating digital content, podcasts and videos, to evaluating the sources that come through your social media feeds. Our work is really focused on the specific question of how do we prepare young people to make sense of online information so that we can equip them to be engaged in our shared democracy. We know that young people are spending their time online. One recent study showed that nearly half of young people report being online almost constantly. And so if that's where we currently stand, how do we make sure that the young people are equipped with the tools to find credible information? And I think it's crucial to be clear that this is not a partisan issue. This is not teaching students what to think. It's how to think. We want to make sure that people are empowered to find good information so that they can make well-informed decisions about issues that will affect themselves and their communities. And so our curriculum is called Civic Online Reasoning because we think it is very much a civic issue to be able to both seek out and evaluate information about issues of civic import online. And the strategies that we seek to teach students are based on research that we did about what does expertise look like in evaluating sources online. And we tried to find groups that we thought would be good at evaluating online sources. And so we did a study led by my colleagues Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew, where we asked 3 groups of people to evaluate unfamiliar sources. And then we recorded their screens as they did and asked them to think out loud. And there were some really striking differences across the groups. The 3 groups were freshmen at Stanford University, young people in the heart of Silicon Valley, many of whom are going to go on to work at tech companies and who are online very frequently. And then also academics, historians, folks who evaluate information for a living. And then finally, fact checkers from the nation's most prominent news organizations. And what we found was that the fact checkers were much more efficient and effective at evaluating unfamiliar sources. And the thing that distinguished them more than anything else was that when they came across an unfamiliar source, they didn't stay on it. Instead, they almost immediately left that source and opened up new tabs in their browsers, and they read about that source to get a sense of what is it? Do I even know what it is that I'm looking at? In contrast, the academics and the students, they tended to stay on one page and to read it very closely and carefully, the kind of strategies that likely made them successful in academics and academia. But those strategies did not serve them as well online because in many cases, our eyes deceive us online. And, one of the tasks we had participants complete was to evaluate a source from minimumwage.com. And minimumwage.com looks like a very professionally designed website. It says that it's a project of the Employment Policies Institute, which is a 501c3. It links to research and has a lot of useful information. And the Employment Policies Institute is a .org website. All these things that students and others among us affiliate with credibility. In contrast, though, if you leave that site and search for information, you can quickly discover that the Employment Policies Institute is run by a Washington, D.C. public relations firm that is working on the behalf of corporate interests that want to keep minimum wage lower. That doesn't mean we need to reject the information on minimumwage.com, but it's really important to know that it has a very particular interest in this issue. All of the fact checkers figured that out. Only 40% of the students did, and only 60% of the academics did. And the move that the fact checkers used was what we call lateral reading. Rather than reading vertically up and down on that one page, they were reading across the tabs in their browser to get a better understanding of the original source. And so that's one of the skills that we try to teach to students is lateral reading, of this disposition towards information rather than accepting it at face value, to try to use the internet to check the internet. What else can I find out about this source before I give it my attention? And we've conducted a whole series of studies, and as have colleagues at other institutions in the United States as well as abroad, more than a dozen studies now with more than 10,000 participants. And they all have positive outcomes, that we can indeed move the needle, that we can help people become better consumers of online information if we teach them a small set of strategies that are focused around this idea of understanding what we're looking at before we dive deeply into the content that it's presenting.
Yeah. I remember reading some of your articles, and the results are really encouraging. And I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about if you've looked at any research that dives into social or cognitive biases in this process, since that's related to my own work. And I'm curious how this connects to skills like lateral reading. Once people learn these skills, do they apply it broadly, or do they only apply it to things that align with their ideological beliefs? Or is there a way where we can get people to apply these skills to all information they consume?
Yeah, so certainly there's more research needed about transfer. We don't have evidence yet of how much students or anybody else who are learning these skills are using them beyond the confines of these research studies. And we know that motivated reasoning is incredibly powerful. And I don't think that this is any kind of silver bullet to defeat motivated reasoning. But we also know that in many cases, students are using, and others are using, really outdated approaches to make sense of online information. And so although this may not fix all of the ills that face us, if we can teach strategies that actually work instead of outdated ones that are ineffective or even misleading. For instance, many students have learned that .org websites are more trustworthy websites, and that kind of guidance appears on libraries and institutions of higher learning all across the country. But anybody can buy a .org website with a few dollars and a few minutes. And yet, students attribute some greater meaning to it. Similarly, students have learned that they should never consult Wikipedia. They have been taught that Wikipedia is not a trustworthy source of information. And we watch fact checkers use Wikipedia to great effect often. Again, it's not that Wikipedia should be the ending place for our research, but it can be a really great jumping off place. So how do we teach students to use Wikipedia wisely? So what we want to do is make sure that if these kinds of approaches to digital literacy are being taught, we want to make sure that we are doing it in a way that is actually going to lead to better outcomes rather than to leading students astray.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious if we could think big picture about what are some of the biggest challenges in scaling digital literacy in higher education, and if there's any policies or curriculum changes that you would want to be able to improve media and digital literacy nationwide.
Yeah, so I think one of the real challenges that faces us is time, that the curriculum is already overloaded and there are not clear places in the curriculum to teach these critically important skills. And so we believe that it is crucial to identify ways to integrate digital literacy into the existing curriculum rather than saying, here's a whole new course or a whole new sequence of things that we're going to teach. Instead, how do we make it part and parcel of existing courses? We have been working in a large intro political science course where we have sought to teach these strategies as part of an intro to American government, and we have seen positive results. We did something similar in a introduction to nutrition course where the examples were all aligned with course content, but teaching those same skills, and we saw that could work. And so going forward, if we're thinking about scaling, we need to make those kinds of materials much more widely available and make them readily adoptable. We know that teachers and instructors and professors have incredibly limited time, and it's unrealistic to expect that everybody all across the country is going to be able to devote a lot of time to making new materials or receive the professional development they need to make those kinds of changes in their courses. And so what we need to do instead is to try to make it as easy as possible. So you could imagine a nationwide database of materials that are for the most commonly taught intro courses, so that you could, if you were teaching Introduction to American Government, go and download a set of materials that have been made, and you could do some tweaking around the edges, but you don't need to build the work. And similarly, that you could find something for an intro to biology course or something else, right? So if we're really thinking about scale of how do you create materials that could be used broadly in big courses and that don't require enormous investments of time and energy, institution by institution.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So as we wrap up here, I'm curious if I get you to think towards the future. I know it's always challenging to look at how things are going to change in the future, but where do you see digital literacy education heading in the next 5 to 10 years, especially with this growing influence of artificial intelligence in our information ecosystems?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things going on there. One is that we've seen, at least at the K-12 level, increasing legislative efforts to mandate this kind of instruction. So 19 states have adopted some kind of legislation around this, and many others have legislation in the pipeline. So I think that we're going to see more and more interest at the K level. And crucially, we need to make sure that there are evidence-based approaches for schools and districts and states to take up, so that as those mandates come into effect, people are not using outdated and misleading resources like the kinds of issues I talked about before. And then in terms of AI, I think that we need to be doing really careful research about what are the ways that we can equip young people to make sense of information, both information that's generated by AI, but also how they can use AI to evaluate information, in the same way that we talk about the wise use of Wikipedia. What's the wise use of AI, and are there ways in which we can take advantage of the incredible power of these large language models to help us evaluate online sources? Ultimately, we want to still be instilling in students the same disposition towards information, which is that question of where did the information come from, right? That we want students to understand that information, and all of us to understand that information is not free floating, right? That it came from somewhere, and where it came from is really important to understand how we think about it. And so we need to make sure that we are thinking about the source of information, even if it is being delivered in a incredibly convincing form by a chatbot. We should still want to know, where did this information come from? Even though that's a very nice answer, what's your source, right? And to be thinking about that, and ultimately developing curriculum materials and testing them out, so that before we get caught up in a wave of new technology hype, we're doing the careful evaluation and piloting of new resources to see what works, and to also devote the resources to keep updating those materials. Yeah, I think that if nothing else, the last couple of years have shown us is that the pace of change is going to be dizzying, and we need to make sure that the resources that we are creating for educational settings are keeping up with the latest technology.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a challenge, but you're doing such important work in this field. So thank you so much for all that you do. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.